Disclaimer. The names, dates, places, and events mentioned in this presentation are based on both U.S. Census results and Mexican Census results. Baptism and birth records, marriage records, both civil and church, death registrations and announcements, military records, and interviews with family members. The use of different names, for example, Neil and Isidro, different name spellings, and conflicting dates of birth, for example, 1905 to 1907, can cause mix-ups, thereby affecting the accuracy of the information. While the facts mentioned here are quite accurate, with a slight margin for error, some of this narrative is also based on personal opinion, a connecting of the dots, if you will. Parts of this narrative are also left to the viewer's interpretation or opinion of the facts. The story can change slightly in its details as more research into the family's history is undertaken.
Generaciones, the Isidro and Dolores Martinez story. Isidro Martinez Martinez is registered as having been born on May 15, 1907 in El Paso, Texas, but always insisted that he was actually born in 1905 in Chihuahua, Mexico. Dolores Montoya Sanchez was born on September 16, 1916 in Artesia, New Mexico. Dolores and Isidro were married on October 31, 1933 in Artesia, New Mexico. But the story of the Isidro and Dolores Martinez familia starts years earlier in the border region of the northern Mexico state of Chihuahua and the western area of the U.S. state of Texas. The northern state of Chihuahua is Mexico's largest state and shares a long international border with the United States at the Rio Grande, including parts of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Two major historical events take place here that would have a direct influence in determining the destiny of hundreds of thousands of Mexican families, including La Familia Martinez. One was the Mexican Revolution that started in 1910 and ended in 1920. The other event was the resulting immigration of Mexicans to the north, namely to the United States. El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, were at the very center of both of these critically historical events. Isidro M. Martinez was born to Bernabé Ibarra Martinez and Tiburcia Contreras Martinez, both of whom were from the state of Durango, which shares a border with Chihuahua to its north. Porfirio Diaz was the president of Mexico at the time and had ruled since 1877. Bernabé and Tiburcia were both from campesino families, ranch and farm laborers, working for landowners, with no land of their own, nor with a hope of ever acquiring some. It is not known at this time if Bernabé and Tiburcia left Durango together or separately, or if they came north with their families. Nor do we know if they came north to join the revolutionary movement or came in search of a better life in the United States. Certainly, they, like so many of the Mexican people, had had their fill of Diaz's iron fist and disregard for the common people who were living in poverty and misery. Whatever the motive, by the early 1900s, they are in Chihuahua where they have a son. Whether born in El Paso or Ciudad Juarez, whether he was born in 1905 or 1907, the time and place of Isidro's birth was chaotic and dangerous, a hotbed of revolution. Diaz favored landowners and foreign investors, leaving the working class, los campesinos, very little chance at prosperity or hope for a future for themselves and their families. Although Diaz had brought a degree of political stability to the nation during his administration, the working class had grown weary of Diaz's dictatorship and his lack of concern for the common people. By 1904 and 1905, public strikes and occasional small armed revolts begin in the northern states of Durango and Chihuahua, but especially in Chihuahua. As the talk of revolution begins to fill the air, General Francisco Pancho Villa, General Pascual Orozco, and General José de la Luz Blanco formed their own independent revolutionary armies in Chihuahua and began to stock up on weapons and supplies. In the presidential election of 1910, Francisco Madero decides to run against Diaz and declares his candidacy for president. He is promptly arrested and sent to jail, but escapes and flees to the state of Texas. Diaz goes on to win a crooked election and continues his rule. While in exile in San Antonio, Texas, Madero calls for the nation to rise up in armed rebellion to start on November 20th of 1910. On that date, Madero, with the support of Generals Villa, Orozco, and Blanco in Chihuahua, and General Emiliano Zapata in Central Mexico, fires the shot that ignites the Mexican Revolution. Bernabe and Tiburcia, who had left their home state of Durango earlier, had been reunited with their parents and siblings. The U.S. Census of 1910 shows Bernabe living with his mother and siblings in El Paso, Texas, and the Mexican Census of 1910 shows Tiburcia living with her parents in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. Bernabe and Tiburcia are not married at this time. Their son Isidro is not mentioned in either census, but family members recall him sharing his memories of living with his grandmother for a time. On May 25 of 1911, the revolutionary generals Villa, Orozco, and Blanco defeat the federal forces of Porfirio Diaz in Ciudad Juarez, where Diaz surrenders and resigns from the presidency. Madero is named the interim leader of the nation. He takes over the Mexican Federal Army and orders that the revolutionary generals disband their armies and send their soldiers to their homes. Generals Villa, Orozco, and Zapata do not comply with that order and keep their armies intact. General Blanco disbands his army, then is named Comandante de la Plaza in Ciudad Juarez, and is charged with setting up the city government and naming its officials. With the war over, although the war starts up again within a year, relative peace and order is reestablished. On June 9th of 1911, just weeks after the end of the war, Bernabe and Tiburcia are married in Ciudad Juarez. They are married by General José de la Luz Blanco, the former revolutionary general. With their son Isidro in tow, Bernabe and Tiburcia establish a home in El Paso, where their second child, George, is born. Their next three children are also born in Texas. The following two children are born in California, and their youngest one born in Artesia, New Mexico, where Bernabe and Tiburcia are buried. The parents of Dolores, who was born in 1916, her father Eligio Sanchez, who was from Rosales, Chihuahua, and her mother Sista Montoya, who was born in San Luis Potosí, are living with their respective families in New Mexico during these early years. In fact, the 1900 U.S. Census shows Eligio living with his parents and siblings in Artesia. Eligio and Sista were married on September 1st, 1914 in Artesia, New Mexico, where they are also buried. The Mexican Revolution was a brutal and very costly war. The number of Mexicans who died during the war is double the number of all of the Americans who died in World War II. Isidro shared with his children his memories of seeing dead bodies in the streets. The government was in chaos, crime was out of control, health services were non-existent, work was scarce, and the country was overflowing with widows and orphans. For multitudes of Mexicans, the future is very bleak. The revolution, which started in 1910, was in actuality a series of short revolts, with one victorious general overthrowing the sitting president, then becoming the new president, only to be overthrown himself later. The war ended in 1920. It was 10 years of death, towns burned down, railroads and highways blown up, changing loyalties amongst the leaders, war atrocities, hunger, betrayal, famine, disease, scarcity of medical supplies, crops destroyed, and the civil war of countryman killing countryman. While the war for democracy and equal rights for all drew many Mexicans north to join the revolution, it also spurred the first major migration from Mexico for those looking to escape the destruction from the war and or their dreary, hopeless existence back home. Many war refugees and political exiles fled to the United States, while others heard of the need for workers in the U.S., offering them a better opportunity for them and their families. El Paso was the main immigration processing center. It is estimated that 1 million Mexicans came north during this 10-year period. After the Mexican-American War of 1846, when the U.S. took control of the conquered territories which had been northern Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Utah, Nevada, and Colorado, many Mexican nationals who lived in these newly conquered territories left their homes in the north to travel south of the new border at the Rio Grande to live in their home country of Mexico. There were more Mexicans actually migrating south to Mexico than north to the United States. The Mexican Revolution was one of two main reasons all of that changed. The other factor that came into play was the fact that the U.S., especially in the southwestern states, was undergoing an industrial revolution. In the agriculture business in particular, there was a great need for laborers. This added to the pull, the attraction of a hope for a better life in the U.S. The U.S.-Mexico border was a lot different than it is now. While the border was maintained and watched, crossing the border was not as strictly monitored as it is today. A person could live in Ciudad Juarez and cross the border to work in El Paso every day and vice versa. Citizens of both countries crossed back and forth across the border with relative ease. The U.S. Border Patrol didn't come into existence until 1924, and as a very small unit whose agents weren't even issued uniforms. But also in 1924, immigration quotas were set in place to limit the number of immigrants coming in and to oversee the quality of immigrants coming to the U.S. The aim was to limit immigration from Asia and Eastern Europe and assure that only immigrants with positive qualities would be allowed to enter. Immigrants from Mexico were exempt from these quotas because they were regarded as hard workers and believed to be just temporary workers who returned to their native country every year, thereby not burdening the country with them forever. This was the argument put forward by American ranchers and farmers before Congress, for they had come to completely depend on the labor provided by Mexican immigrant workers. Mexicans have been working the fields, ranches, farms, and orchards of the American Southwest, following the seasonal crops from place to place for generations. Even going back to when the Southwest Territory was still part of Mexico, before the U.S. took possession of the conquered area after the Mexican-American War, our people have tilled the soil, planted the seed, and harvested the bounty of this great land. The flow of Mexican immigrants continued steadily over the next few years, but more and more strict immigration laws were also being introduced at a steady pace, making border crossing more difficult, finally culminating with the Immigration Act of 1929. With the beginning of the Great Depression of 1929, entire industries dried up, and the need for immigrant labor decreased. Due to the lack of jobs for its own citizens, the U.S. began to limit the number of people crossing the border. The Immigration Act mandated that immigrants must legally enter the U.S. only at official ports of entry. At these ports of entry, El Paso being their primary center of immigration crossings, immigrants had to pay an entry fee and undergo a humiliating delousing procedure to cleanse them of possible lice. Thousands of immigrants were crossing the border on a daily basis for work and school and paying the entry fee every day while having to strip naked to be sprayed with kerosene. This was dehumanizing and unbearable for many. Also, Mexican immigrants were encouraged to leave the U.S., and many did, even some who held American citizenship. These changes caused two things. First, many migrant workers who returned to Mexico after the working season now decided to stay in the U.S. permanently for fear of not being allowed to re-enter the country to work. And secondly, the new laws created a huge increase in illegal border crossings. because immigrants wanted to avoid paying the entry fee, many on a daily basis, and the humiliation of delousing. Thus, beginning America's controversial relationship with Mexican immigration, both legal and illegal. In the early 1900s, after the first phase of the Mexican Revolution had ended in 1911, Isidro's parents, Bernabé and Tiburcia, settled into a home in El Paso, Texas, with their young son, where they continued adding to and raising their family. Bernabé found work as a farm and ranch laborer and also worked on the railroad. These jobs required constant travel to other cities and states. There were many occasions when the family split up temporarily to follow work opportunities. Although his parents were lacking in formal education and could not speak, read, or write in English, Isidro and his siblings were able to attend school for several years and learned English. As Isidro got older, he also helped out the family by going to work, mainly as a farm and ranch worker, although he also worked for the railroad, maintenance at a minor league baseball stadium, and briefly as a park ranger. When his siblings reached age, they also joined in getting work to help the family. The family worked in many jobs, including cemetery worker, painter, field work, building maintenance, gardener, and general laborer. Field work involved following the seasonal crops, which caused a lot of moving around for the family. The family traveled to Arizona, New Mexico, and as far as California in search of work. Isidro and his siblings George, Francisco, Jenny, and Ausencio were born in Texas during the Revolutionary War years. The next two siblings, Nicolasa and Bernardo, were born in California, while the youngest, Ignacio, was born in New Mexico. Life was hard. Sometimes there was no running water. At times, an outhouse in the backyard served as the family bathroom. Temporary labor camps with hot tents and bare dirt floors were no fun. Racism and discrimination was rampant. Fieldwork was torturous. 10 and 12-hour long, back-breaking workdays under the burning sun, 6 days a week, no overtime, no union protection, no benefits, no child labor laws, and having to endure abuse from corrupt foremen and work supervisors. The seasonal crops consisted of grapes, lettuce, cotton, citrus, tomatoes, carrots, apples, pears, strawberries, and others. The jobs offered very low wages, making money a constant cause of stress and worry. But it was honest, respectable work and allowed the family to grow and to prosper.
By 1927, the Bernabé and Tiburcia Martinez family is living in Artesia, New Mexico, where Isidro befriends Eligio Sanchez, his future father-in-law. Isidro marries Eligio's eldest daughter, Dolores, on October 31, 1933, in Artesia, New Mexico, Dolores' birthplace. Isidro is 26 years old and Dolores is 17 years of age. Isidro and Dolores were married in the middle of the Great Depression, 1929 to 1941. The Depression was, and still is, regarded as the biggest economic collapse to hit the U.S. in its entire history. The stock market collapsed dramatically overnight, causing thousands of businesses to go under. Hundreds of people lost their fortunes, and many committed suicide. The unemployment rate reached 25%. 1 out of every 4 persons were out of jobs. Today, for comparison, the unemployment rate is 3.9%. Food supplies were drastically low. The government issued food vouchers to the population, which were used on the days when people were allowed to purchase food because there wasn't enough in stock to be available on a daily basis. Extremely long lines formed at soup kitchens throughout the country. Desperate situations drove many people to stealing, scavenging landfills, begging, cheating, and violence. Congress passed the Homestead Act, Prohibition, which outlawed the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages. The law was active from 1920 to 1933. But this did not stop the demand for alcohol, and thousands of illegal moonshine stills sprang up all over the country, including the Southwest. The thirst for alcohol gave a lot of people, including many of Mexican descent, an opportunity to provide for themselves and their families by working for bootleggers as distillers, drivers, packers, and security. Some became bootleggers themselves. Mexican smugglers were used to transport alcohol from Mexico, where it was still legal to produce alcohol. This led to the beginning of organized crime in the U.S., led by the likes of Al Capone, Frank Costello, and Lucky Luciano. Due to the lack of jobs, including agricultural work, the Immigration Act of 1929 was enacted by the government to encourage the expelling of Mexican immigrants back to Mexico. Throughout the 1930s, Mexicans never accounted for less than 85% of all immigration prisoners. 3 new prisons were constructed near the border to house the overflow: La Tuna Prison in El Paso, Texas, Prison Camp No. 10 in Tucson, Arizona, and Terminal Island in Los Angeles, California. During the Depression, which lasted until 1941, it is estimated that 400,000 Mexicans, including many who held U.S. citizenship, were given one-way tickets to Mexico. It was a very dangerous and scary time for anyone of Mexican descent. Isidro and Dolores were able to find enough work and scrape out a modest living to provide for their growing family in spite of always being on the search for and having to compete for work throughout the southwestern states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. They also had to combat the pressure from the government to leave the U.S. for Mexico, which was still suffering from the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. They had very little formal education, faced racism and discrimination on a daily basis, and finances were a constant struggle. Many times, some of the children were left with relatives for a period, while Isidro and Dolores had to travel, often out of state, for work. Dolores gave birth to 7 children during the years of the Depression: Asuncion, 1934, Inés, 1936, Ponciana, 1937, Saturnino, 1939, Micaela, 1940, and twins Manuel and Manuela, 1941, all born in New Mexico. The Great Depression came to an end in 1941 with the start of the U.S. involvement in World War II. To provide for the war effort in World War II, production increased in the U.S. Vehicle, airplane, and railroad production was cranked up. The oil, weapons, and ammunition industries went to full capacity. Clothing, footwear, and especially food production, to name a few industries, increased many times over, creating a burgeoning economy and thousands upon thousands of new jobs, which led to the end of the Depression. There was a new call or clamoring for Mexican workers to come north. Again, Mexico becomes the supplier of cheap, reliable labor in the American Southwest as immigrants are invited back north. In 1942, Isidro, most probably due to his age, officially 35, but most likely 37 years of age, and perhaps as the head of a family of 7 children, including newborn twins, was not drafted into the U.S. Armed Forces for World War II. But 3 of his much younger brothers, Francisco, Ausencio, and Bernardo Martinez, as well as 2 of Dolores' brothers, Esteban and Bernardo Sanchez, were drafted and served in the Army until the end of the war. Mexican Americans have a strong and proud tradition of service in the military of our country. This history includes 61 winners of the Medal of Honor, the richest military honor that can be won. This family has greatly contributed to that very extraordinary history of service and sacrifice to the people and government of our great nation. We understand that the freedoms we enjoy as a nation do not come without a price. We can hold our heads high. In the early 1940s, the Martinez family is living in Texas, where they welcomed their 8th child, Rita, 1944, and twins Lorenzo and Lorenza in 1946. Throughout this time period and the following years, the family traveled around the Southwest following the seasonal crops and wherever work opportunities presented themselves. There was a constant moving from home to home. Oftentimes, the family had to split up, especially when childcare was needed. There were 10 kids in the family, including 2 sets of twins at the time. There was no prenatal care for pregnant women, Medi-Cal did not exist, and medical services were expensive. Extended family was a great source of support. Many times, there was not enough work for everyone in one town, so they split up. Repeatedly having to change schools must have also created a lot of problems in the children's pursuit of an education, although having to make new friends so frequently was never a big problem, because they had each other, and there were plenty of siblings. In 1949, Asuncion, the eldest child, is married to Manuel Reyes and makes a home in Texas. In 1953, Micaela, the third eldest daughter, is married to Teodoro Huerta, settling in New Mexico. Although Dolores had been blessed with 10 children by this time, in the years between 1942 and 1952, unfortunately, she also suffered a miscarriage and lost 4 infants, none of which lived longer than a month or two. In that same year of 1953, Isidro and Dolores gather their 8 remaining unmarried children and move to California. Initially arriving in the city of Salinas in Monterey County, they settle nearby in the small coastal town of Moss Landing, where they had found work at a ranch. Moss Landing lies at the outskirts of the city of Watsonville in neighboring Santa Cruz County. The family settled in the Moss Landing, Watsonville area, where work was plentiful. The family started working in the fields and orchards of the area, harvesting various fruits and vegetables, planting seedlings, placing irrigation pipes, driving tractors, and delivery trucks were some of their work duties. In 1956, their daughter, Cecilia, is born in Salinas, California. She is the 11th and last child of Isidro and Dolores Martinez. Eventually, the family moved into other jobs as the children grew older. Several of them worked in the many canneries throughout the area. Watsonville was a large regional center for processing, packaging, and refrigeration of fruit and vegetables. As the children grew and matured, they began to marry and start their own families. Saturnino marries Martha Montes on February 5, 1956 in Watsonville. Inés marries Agustina Fuentes on July 25, 1957 in Watsonville. Manuel marries Mary Regalado on October 16, 1959 in Monterey County. In 1961, Micaela's husband, Teodoro, passes away and she leaves New Mexico with her 4 children and moves to Watsonville. Manuela marries Eleuterio Fuentes on September 21, 1962 in Hollister, California. On June 7, 1963, Micaela marries Lupe Vallejo in Watsonville. Lorenza marries Benjamin Ruiz on May 4, 1964 in Pajaro, California. Dolores Sanchez Martinez passes away on April 28, 1966, and is buried in Watsonville. That same year of 1966, Asuncion, her husband, Manuel Reyes, and their children moved to Watsonville. As the years roll by, the family continues to grow and prosper, although the death of their mother, Dolores, weighed heavily on all of their hearts. Money was never in abundance, times were difficult, but there was never a lack of love, and food was always on the table. The family continued celebrating life with quinceañeras, baby births, weddings, and graduations. Working, raising children, and spending time with each other were the main activities. Lorenzo marries Mary Ordaz on January 1, 1967 in Watsonville. Rita marries Heriberto Terán on September 6, 1967 in Watsonville. Cecilia marries Antonio Acosta on February 7, 1972 in Los Angeles. While some of the older siblings stayed and made Watsonville their permanent home with their families, most of the younger ones gradually moved away with their families to make a home elsewhere. Isidro M. Martinez passes away on July 23, 1976 in Watsonville. With his death, the first generation of the Isidro and Dolores Martinez family is laid to rest. Their children, the second generation of the family, the 11 clans, take their place as the living elders of the family, leading the family into the next generation. Through their sacrifice, unconditional love, hard work, and with a little tough love at times, they were able to provide for their families, giving their children opportunities to obtain an education and earn a better life for themselves. The family at large and each individual clan family were advancing into better paying jobs, enabling them to begin buying their own homes. The family continued to grow in number and extended beyond Watsonville and even California. As the years roll by, unfortunately and inevitably, the second generation of the Martinez family began to join the first generation, their parents, in rest. In 1996, Ponciana S. Martinez passes away. Inés S. Martinez passes away in 2000. In 2004, Lorenzo S. Martinez passes away. Saturnino S. Martinez passes away in 2008. In 2018, Manuel S. Martinez passes away. As a third generation begins to take its place in leading the family into the future, the Isidro and Dolores Martinez family continues to grow and to flourish, united in love and loyalty. We honor our living elders and our ancestors by continuing the family legacy of hard work, love of family, perseverance in face of adversity, and love for our country. The family steadily continues to blossom as we enjoy more educational accomplishments, succeeding in more and greater career opportunities, continuing the family legacy of military service to our country, and helping to tap into the limitless potential in our children by nurturing them with unconditional love, patience, and devotion. The following generations will take this family to even greater heights.